This episode of Grace to Stand is a continuation of our conversation from last episode with PCA statesman Dr. O. Palmer Robertson, missionary, theologian, pastor, writer, seminary professor. It was such a joy to have that conversation last week with him as we discussed his current project, a 3-volume set, 3 books entitled Christ of the Consummation, building on all his work starting way back 40 years ago, I guess, with the Christ of the Covenants. This episode, we are going to discuss the founding and the forming of the PCA. He was there those beginning days. He's going to tell us the reasons why he left the PCUS to start this new denomination. What are some of the principles that undergirded the founding of the denomination, and what his hope is for us today? There's going to be some sections on this episode that are common to the last episode just to make it more coherent, but the vast majority of this is brand new material. Enjoy.
You know, one of the reasons, Palmer, you know, you're in Piedmont Triad Presbytery with Darin and myself, and but you've been away for a little while too. But one of the real reasons we want to have you on is it was hailed as a monumental moment that you were at General Assembly. You were taking pictures with people at this General Assembly. You got the chance to speak at the General Assembly. And I've just heard on other podcasts and other places how excited they are and were that you were there and active. And I said, man, we gotta hear from this dear saint who's been with us since the founding of our denomination and hear some of his perspectives. And so that's part of why we wanted to have you on.
Well, thank you very much. And it was a real joy to be back among the brothers again. And you know, there's nothing like a General Assembly. The singing is absolutely inspiring and anticipating what heaven will be like.
50 years in the PCA, and well, I don't know that you want us to say your age on here, but
I'm 85 years of age.
There, thank you. 85, and so you were 35 when the PCA was formed, and what denomination were you ordained in?
Right, I was a part of the PCUS, the Southern Presbyterian Church, as it is lovingly known, and was there. I would have to think as to 15. I was ordained in about 55 or 65, 1965. I'm thinking I may have my figures wrong. 65. I think I was ordained in the PCUS in 1965 in the South Mississippi Presbytery at a metropolis city called Picayune, Mississippi. And I had some of my happiest years as a pastor in Picayune, Mississippi. Before
the metropolis city of Picayune, and Picayune means small, right? Is that
right? A Picayune is the smallest French coin, and Picayune is very close to New Orleans, and there was a woman who was from the area that eventually was named Picayune, who was the editor of the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. And they asked her, well, this little area is developing. What should we call it? And she said, well, name it after my newspaper, Picayune. So that's where it got its name, Picayune, Mississippi.
That's right. The New Orleans Times-Picayune. That's the newspaper down there, right there.
How do you know that, Darin? Darin, how do you know?
Well, I formerly pastored First Presbyterian Church in Biloxi, Mississippi, which is not too far away from Picayune, and went to RTS in Jackson, and I learned it. I just milked it for all I could work. I came from California to Mississippi, which was as much of a culture shock as you going from the United States to Africa, probably. So it was quite a difference, but it's a great place. The Lord is I mean, there are just so many wonderful, godly people there, and grateful for the time in Mississippi. So, I mean, thinking back to you having been ordained in the mid 60s in Picayune, Mississippi, in the Southern Presbyterian Church. And then somewhere around 7-8 years into your ordained ministry, everything kind of goes haywire, and there is the inception of the National Presbyterian Church, which is now known as the Presbyterian Church in America. Tell us a little bit about that from, just an eyewitness point of view and your vantage point of what that was like then. Maybe some even lessons that we can learn now as members in the local church, and those of us who are listening as pastors in the local church. But just some of the lessons and experiences you had as the PCA came into being.
Yes, one of my fondest memories and experiences in the early days of preceding the PCA and its formation was the character of the pastors and the elders in that Southern Presbyterian Church. If you'll excuse me, having come from California down to Mississippi, in the South, you can talk about the gracious South, and there is a certain truth of that, in that these men were so committed to the standards of the church and to upholding those standards, but they fought the good fight in a gracious way. They were not combative. They took their stand, and they were always courteous and gracious in the way they did it, but they did not waver in the stand that they took. The other thing that affected, that was such a blessing to me in those early days, was the character of the pastors and the lifestyle of the pastors. I can remember they had so many wonderful lessons that they taught in their lifestyle. Just one example comes to mind. There was a pastor in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who was kind of on the other side of the railroad track. And then the large part of Hattiesburg was on this side of the railroad track. And there was a movement to plant a new church. And one of the arguments in Presbytery was, no, we can't have any more churches. We've got more churches than we can actually fill as it is. And to introduce another church is going to take all our membership away from our church. And this gracious pastor, who had to overcome his location because he was on the other side of the railroad track, he stood up and he said, brothers, when you've got gasoline stations, where do they congregate? One on this corner, one on that corner, one on the next corner. They don't bother one another. They attract one another. And the more churches we have, the better. Now, I want to tell you that any time anyone moved into that community, the first person to knock on their door, day or night, and visit and welcome them into the community was the pastor of that church on the other side of the railroad tracks. And but he was willing to risk everything. If anybody was going to lose members with this new church, he was the one that was going to do so. But he stood up in Presbytery and said, go for it. Go for it. It will just make us all richer to have another church. And if we could get some of that feeling, and, this particular presbytery is very distinctive in that so many of the churches here are church plants. but I get the feeling that it might have been 10 years since we planted another church. I think we're starting one now, but I was really distressed a few presbyteries ago when we closed down a church that we had trying to plant. I had never seen that before.
You know, that makes a lot of sense of that meeting. I remember you've laid low since you've come into our presbytery, but that I saw it really bothered you that we would be closing that church. I think that might be one of the first times you spoke up in a presbytery meeting. And so thanks for sharing just your heart about that now, because I get it now.
Yeah, I was ready. I was ready to volunteer to go and preach over there for free to keep that church going. You just don't kill a church unless it's, I can understand, and I don't question the wisdom of the presbytery, but that's just one illustration of these men. They're warm-hearted and hard-working. I mean, they were knocking. How many pastors? I just wonder how many pastors today do pastoral calls among their membership in their churches. I don't think when I was in a church in Washington, D.C., we had 25 elders and 25 deacons. I couldn't possibly visit all the people, so I decided to start with visiting all the elders. I came to one of the elders' homes. I knocked on his door. He'd been an elder there for many, many years. He greeted me at the door with this big smile, stuck his hand out to me and said, "Welcome. You are the first pastor that has ever come into my home." Well, but how much visitation do we do in evangelism? You can often get the gas customer list of new people as they come in. In Picayune, we sent out invitations to every person who moved into town. You're welcome to our community. You're welcome to come and visit us. But, to use creativity, and that was the attitude and atmosphere. And they weren't so wrapped up into all sorts of finaglings in church politics, if you want to call it that. They were out there taking the gospel. They were revivalists, reformationists, reaching out for Christ with the gospel. I remember, I think it may have been Frank Barker, one of the early pastors. There were some gathering together of ministers in a restaurant, and there had been some sort of question as to whether they should say a blessing openly, publicly, or whether they should just, say it quietly. Well, he gets down on his knees in the middle of the restaurant and opens his mouth and leads in prayer for the whole body in thanks to the Lord. Well, there you go.
So just for our listeners to be clear, all these stories you're telling, these are stories of the newly founded PCA or of the PCUS you were coming out of?
It's the same people.
Okay, yeah.
But it would be the newly founded PCA. Yes, it was mostly illustrations. Well, it would have gone back from all of these people that I mentioned were founding fathers of the PCA.
Sure, Frank Barker, of course. So what were some of the feelings of having to start a new denomination? I know you guys didn't just jump into that haphazardly. It must have been a mixture of feelings. What was it like?
Yes, it was a difficult decision to make for some, and some decided that they, in conscience, could not feel that they could leave the denomination, and we totally respected them. That was another aspect. It wasn't, you better come on and move along with us. It wasn't that kind of thing at all. But I do remember I was at that time teaching at Westminster and in Philadelphia, and I was outside the bounds of where all this activity was going. And I got a call from a pastor who was one of the early leaders of the church, and from Macon, Georgia. And he calls and he says, "Well, Palmer, are you with us or are you not with us?" And I had to make my decision. Am I going to cut my ties? You know, for some people, there was the danger that they would lose all the money that they had invested in retirement. You know, there was some possibility that churches would lose their properties. In the Northern Presbyterian Church, that happened regularly. In the Southern Church, because of a number of reasons, most of the churches, even the big ones like Coral Ridge Presbyterian, took their whole multi-million-dollar building along with them when they came out. But you know, there was questions as to, and so you had to be ready to pay the price. And so many paid the price of cutting the ties, of venturing out, not knowing what was going to be there. And the Lord brought us together in a wonderful way.
So what was it for you? If you had to summarize that in your mind, what were some of the key factors in you deciding to leave and join this new denomination?
Yes, one of the really sad things about the Northern Presbyterian Church is that immediately after the kicking out of Machen and some of his followers that formed the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, they didn't leave. They were kicked out of the Northern Presbyterian Church. They were defrocked in a very unjust manner. Machen not even being allowed to speak in the General Assembly in his own defense, and so forth. But they, when they came out within just a few years, they divided again. And they divided over issues that were, in hindsight, were not really proper reasons for dividing. And as I personally looked at the PCUS and those coming out, ooh, Lord, don't let that happen. You know, let us not divide again, and let us have a spirit that will enable us to stay together, even if we start on polar opposites. And so that was one thing I had to work through. Another was, is there a legitimate biblical grounds for separation? And some of my very respected people, the president of Reformed Seminary that had just been founded a few years before then, Sam Patterson, decided not to leave the PCUS out of strong convictions, and we had to honor that. But so what my settlement was in what was called the Union Presbyteries, where the PCA, the PCUS, the Southern Presbyterian Church, approved of the merger of presbyteries along the border of the North and the South, so that a person, if they were brought to trial for not believing the confession or the scriptures, they could decide whether they would be tried by the North, which had adopted the Confession of 1967, which denied the virgin birth of Christ, did not affirm the bodily resurrection of Christ, or they could choose to be tried in the South under the PCUS, which was still strongly holding to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And to me, that was a legitimate constitutional grounds, because now we would have people at the General Assembly level, the highest court of the church, that would no longer be required to affirm the Westminster Confession of Faith because of these merged presbyteries. So that was something that I had to work through. in our day now in the PCA, one lesson that I would say I would encourage us as brothers not to jump too quickly if we find ourselves in disagreement with other brothers in the PCA, and separate ourselves. We have to be really sure that there is a strong and confessional grounds for a separation, if that's what we should ever. And Lord, please, if possible, let us continue as one church and not a split Presbyterian church.
So what I earlier, before we started recording, I used the term grassroots with you, and you kind of reshaped what I was saying. But my question was, in the founding of the PCA and how the courts of the church were meant to operate, and some of the heart behind the founders in writing our Book of Church Order and all of that, how do you see, or what's some of the reasoning behind how teaching elders and ruling elders and floor debates and committees and commissions operate? What is some of how that began as the church was born in 1973?
Yes, it goes back to the perception as to how our beloved Southern Presbyterian Church, the PCUS, had gone into error. How is it that we had moved away from our confessional standards? Well, part of that was the seminaries that led us astray. But the other thing in our perception was the denominational, the General Assembly committees, particularly the Committee on Christian Education. And the Committee on Christian Education was putting out literature. It was called the covenant literature, interestingly. They were working with the covenant, but these upper level committees were promoting doctrines and teachings of Scripture that were accepting higher critical views. For instance, the unity or disunity of the book of Isaiah. And behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, rather than a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And so when the structure of the General Assembly was developed, I can remember so well Charles Donahue, who was very much behind this, one of our founding fathers. Charles was sharing with me how relieved he was when we set up this situation of the committees of commissioners. What was the committee of commissioners? The committees of commissioners were established so that they would be the place of accountability of the General Assembly committees. And these committees of commissioners were to have an equal number of ruling and teaching elders. And these ruling and teaching elders at the General Assembly would receive the reports of the permanent committees, such as Mission to the World or Mission of North America or Christian Education. Those committees would bring their reports to the committees of commissioners for their review and control. And if these representatives from all the different presbyteries, one elder, one teaching elder, one ruling elder, alternating from the various presbyteries, would come together, and the Mission to the World executive would have to give account to these ruling and teaching elders. And the whole structure was designed to keep us from what we felt had led us astray, which was basically a top-down governance, where those few that were in the committees of commissioner or the permanent committees would determine on their own what their policies would be, how they would function, what they would do with their money, all of those things. And if they produce some literature, the Christian Ed Committee, that was for them to decide in the old days. But now whatever they produced was subject to the review and control, not of more hierarchy, certainly not just of pastors or a selection of pastors, but of ruling and teaching elders that represented all the different presbyteries. So that was a very critical matter.
So let me, sorry to interrupt, Palmer. So,
Yeah.
At this last General Assembly, we actually saw that in action in quite a few ways, where the Committee of Commissioners, I don't know if overrule was the right word, but actually changed, didn't go with the committee recommendation, but exercised that authority that they have by virtue of our agreed upon polity to take a different course of action. And so I think thank you for those original, for you founders who put that in place, because I appreciated the ability to do that. And I served on one of those committees myself. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very healthy thing. And I think that was wonderful to see that functioning in this last General Assembly, that these committees of commissioners were there and doing their job. They had received the reports of the permanent committees in advance, or bills and overtures and so forth, had reviewed them, and then decided by their majority vote, or even they could bring in a minority report, which at least in one case ended up being approved by the General Assembly as a minority report of one of the committees of commissioners. So, if we can just continue to strengthen that, and it's a healthy thing, because that will encourage those who are executives in the PCA to understand that a part of our unity, a part of our abiding unity, will be when we do have an agreement from the presbyteries to what the General Assembly is doing.
Oh yeah, I just was thinking. I mean, you have shared a lot about the history of the PCA and some of the facets of how the PCA came into being and what makes a PCA unique. A lot of that equality of teaching elders and ruling elders, and much of what you just said on the committee levels. I'm thinking about, Lord willing, and if the Lord tarries, the PCA will be intact in 50 more years. And in order for that to be the case, what do you see the church, and I'm speaking specifically of our denomination, really needing to double down upon right now? What do we need to, if we're going to be faithful to the scriptures, true to the Reformed faith, and obedient to the Great Commission? What is it that we truly need to double down upon in order for the PCA to continue to be a healthy denomination in the years to come?
Yes, I think to be what it professes to be is the main thing. That the church is satisfied to be what it professes to be. I don't see a lot of danger in the PCA at this point, at least, in trying to get involved in declarations about the government and what should be happening in Washington, D.C. There are issues, the abortion issue and so forth, that needs to be spoken to. But that was one of the elements of the old denomination that they began to drift into. But the other thing is to recognize that the devil is so subtle. The devil is very subtle. And if we get into caucus as over against open debate for determining issues, we're going to lose the unity that we have.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a group of, if the pattern comes where there's a group over here that are having a caucus before a presbytery meeting or before a general assembly, and they're deciding all of these ways that they're going to, steps that they're going to follow to accomplish what they think ought to be done, and another group meeting over here trying to make plans to make their program work, then you've got the very basic structures of unity being destroyed. But if you have a concept that the way in which the church is decided, or issues are to be decided, is by open debate, and here again, this is where I would appeal to the lessons I learned from Africa. In terms of worship, you start when everybody gets there, and you finish when everybody's finished. And as they say, you've got watches, but we've got time. And what is the big hurry? Why does the church need executives that will drive us rather than a deliberative assembly in the presbytery and in the general assembly where everyone is satisfied that they've had enough opportunity to express their views, they have been heard, and then a decision is made on the basis of each man having his voice and his vote, and then a decision is made and we accept that decision. But when you get a feeling that things are being pushed, then you destroy the potential of unity.
Do you think?
Yes.
Do you think it's like the idea to push things to commissions, and then what we hear is to trust the commission? Do you think that's a pragmatic argument because the PCA is getting too large, or like why do you think that is? Why do you think there's a move away from deliberative local and national meetings to more commissions to carry out work?
Well, I've seen some of that over the history of the PCA. There was a point in which there was an effort to shorten the assemblies. As a matter of fact, when the PCA was started, the committees of commissioners would start meeting on Saturday before the General Assembly. And then there would be no business done on Sunday. Everyone would go to worship and enjoy the fellowship of worshiping morning and evening with the brothers at various churches. And then Monday, everybody was ready to go with the business, and nobody asked any questions about going from Monday to Friday. So you started to Saturday and ran to Friday. And one of the arguments was, well, you'll get more ruling elders if you cut short the assembly from a Tuesday afternoon to a Friday morning. Well, that hasn't worked. We don't have any more representation percentage-wise that way. But that cutting down of the time has, I think, been a factor that was debated at different points, was decided upon or tried and reversed for a while. But right now we've got a short assembly, and that's not it's not that you must have a long assembly, but I think men need to appreciate the value of everyone, please let some of the ruling elders have an opportunity to express themselves in presbytery meetings, in General Assembly. Encourage them to come with understanding and to make their views known.
In the presbytery we're in, we have really good ruling elder involvement, and I'm glad we have a Saturday meeting because it enables ruling elders to come. And you actually have to report. You have to get an excused absence if you don't send your REs. But I come from a presbytery that I think in some meetings, wherever it was hosted, they would tell in that presbytery, that church, make sure you have your ruling elders there, because those would be the only two ruling elders in the whole meeting, or whatever would make a quorum. And I think in recent years, there's been a move to say, let the teaching elders, let the pastors do the business of the church, and you guys just shepherd the flock, kind of thing. And so I appreciate your heart behind expressing the need for ruling elders to speak up, to have a voice, to be involved in the courts of the church. Yeah. Any more thoughts on that in particular?
Rob, nothing in particular, just that we should all encourage our ruling elders. Common sense is a very important factor, and people, as a minister, I'm speaking as a minister. Sometimes we're not as practical as we need to be. And, some voices from ruling elders, that's where most of the money comes from. It comes from the ruling elders, and they should feel like they have a right to decide where their money is going and be happy about how their money is being spent.
Was there any kind of a noteworthy role ruling elders had in the founding of the PCA?
Yes, there were several organizations that preceded the formation of the PCA, and one of them was called Concerned Presbyterians, and it was Kenneth Keyes from down in your original area in Miami was a major feature there. There was another Presbyterian, Churchmen United was of the ministers, but this was an organization of the ruling elders. Another was the Pensacola Theological Institute, in which there was a lot of participation by ruling elders coming in. And the Presbyterian Journal was the magazine that it was started by L. Nelson Bell, who was the father-in-law of Billy Graham from right up here in Asheville, North Carolina. And he started that magazine to counter the liberal magazine that was called the Presbyterian Outlook. And so it was called the Southern Presbyterian Journal, started by a ruling elder. And he had been a missionary for many years as a medical doctor. And Ruth Bell Graham, if you know, she grew up on the mission field. But there was a lot of lay participation in all of those different organizations that preceded the founding of the PCA.
Yeah. So I know we're running long, maybe, but I would love to hear some ministry reflections you have over 60 plus years of ministry as like you said, a jack of all trades, a professor, a missionary, a theologian, an author, a pastor, all of it. This Christian life that you've seen it all, and you've seen it across the globe. What are some of your reflections and encouragements for this generation of Christians?
That's a big question.
Too big. Another episode.
I don't know that I can. Let's see. What kind of reflections can I give?
Maybe we'll have you on another day.
But don't cut me off too quickly. I do have a couple of thoughts that I.
All right, good. I'm glad we'll go as long as you want. So this is great.
Very interesting. There was an interview recently of Sinclair Ferguson, and someone, he's he and I are about the same age. I think I'm a little older than he. Yeah, maybe quite a bit older, but at any rate, they were asking, looking back over your career, what would you change? And one of the things that he said was more Bible. And you say, Sinclair Ferguson, more Bible? And I would agree 100%. More Bible. I do not think the younger generation really appreciates the prophets. I don't think they have read much in the book of Proverbs. And that's a judgment that I'm giving here, and that sounds negative, and maybe they do, but the whole Bible and nothing but the Bible is so critical for our own personal lives and for our ministry. The more we absorb the Bible, the better. The other thing that he said is more prayer. And I think that's absolutely critical. And the third was more love. All of those elements are really very critical for the next generation and the generation after that too. Those things that are just so basic. Mm-hmm. That makes the man and determines the future of the life of the church.
How do you think, and this will be my last question, but how do you think the church can go about cultivating that in her people better than it is now? I mean, better than the church is doing so now. And when you think of, when I ask the question, the next 50 years of the PCA, our future pastors, ruling elders, mothers, fathers, campus ministers, businessmen are all coming out of the children that have yet to be born, even, and including the children that are born. So, what can the church do now to cultivate the church in a direction where there's more Bible, more prayer, more love?
Mm-hmm. Great question, Darin.
Yes, it is a very good question. I think prayer to that goal, and I think along with that, more catechism. Interestingly, I took copies of the Children's Catechism over to the Great Commission Church, the Sudanese, and I gave out copies to the men, and they said, "Oh, that looks good. Could we have some more?" Well, how many more do you want? Well, 5. Well, 10. Well, 15. Sure, I'll give you 15. Here's 15 right here. And could we have some more? Yeah. How many more you want? Well, 15 more. Okay. So I'm taking them 30 children's catechisms, and they're excited about that. They're raising up that generation. But that kind of foundation deep down in the soul that's memorized. Calvin did it, said you've got to raise children that know the catechism. They have to learn the catechism. It has to be deep, deep inside those basic doctrines and truths. Now, as far as scripture reading, I think by example, and of course, I would urge everyone to get Matthew Henry's Way to Pray that I have revised. It's a absolutely unique book. All scripture turned into a form of prayer. It will change your life if you use it. I've used it more than any other book over all my life since my conversion. My mother gave me her copy, and that will enlarge your prayer visions massively. And I think encouraging through the Bible reading, annual through the Bible reading. I've got a schedule. My wife Joanna has developed her own 5-day schedule instead of 7 days. and she's coordinated the Psalms with the historical books of the Old Testament very interestingly. But, you have to make a deliberate commitment. And yes, you start every January, but you can start in March as well, or you can start in October and read through the Bible this year. I had one good ARP pastor's wife tell me that for something like 20 years, she had read through the Bible every year. And that would be a great challenge. I try to read through the Psalms every month. If you go back and see what the monks used to do, they'd read through the Psalms every week and memorizing large portions of Scripture. Just, all sorts of encouragement. The Navigator's memory system is a great place to start. There are lots of practical ways.
Wow.
That's a great word. Dr. Robertson, thank you so much for those insights and words of wisdom, reflections upon your ministry, the contributions that you've made. What a privilege it's been to spend a little bit of time with you today. It's been a joy, and Lord willing, we'll have the opportunity to do it again in the future.
Thank you so much, Darin, and George as well. It was a blessing for me.
Oh, likewise. And so I guess with that, we will sign off. And so, maybe we'll have you on another day. This was great.
Really good.